Valor is brought to you by e.l.f. Cosmetics. Anything is e.l.fing possible. It was April 17th, 2018, a little after 10:30 a.m. Southwest Airlines Flight 1380 took off from LaGuardia Airport in New York City. It was scheduled to land in Dallas, Texas in 3 hours and 47 minutes. The flight's captain, Tammie Jo Shults, settled into her routine with her first officer, Darren Ellisor. Each had spent thousands of hours of their lives in the air. They knew their routines like the back of their hands. But 20 minutes later, that routine was shattered.
It felt like we were T-boned by a Mack truck on the captain's side.
That's the voice of Tammie Jo Shults. She and Darren had no idea what happened. Their plane was rapidly descending. Smoke was filling the cockpit. The noise was so loud, it was deafening. As the captain of the flight, it was Tammie Jo's responsibility to land Southwest Flight 1380. But Tammie Jo was not just any captain. She had served our country as one of the Navy's first female pilots. Now, she would have to draw upon that training for a new mission, to safely land Southwest Flight 1380. Hi, I'm Deshauna Barber, and this is Valor, a limited series about female trailblazers in the United States military. In this episode, we're telling the story of retired Navy Lieutenant Commander Tammie Jo Shults and how a lifetime of building habits helped her land Southwest Flight 1380. Valor is presented by e.l.f. Cosmetics. We can't always control what happens to us, but we can always control how we react. This is the story of Tammie Jo Shults, who knew exactly what to do in the face of a life-threatening crisis. Tammie Jo grew up in the 1960s and 70s on farms and ranches in New Mexico and Colorado. It was a childhood built on routine and discipline. Tammie Jo's chores started before breakfast.
We'd get up and milk a couple of cows, feed about 1,000 head of hogs, 1,500 head of cattle.
Now, I didn't grow up on a farm, so this sounds pretty intimidating to me, but Tammie Jo saw it much differently.
When you get into that habit and you haven't done it any other way, then it's not a big deal to get up and do that because it's just what you do in the morning. To me, it was fun.
But as much as Tammie Jo loved the farm life, she envisioned a different future for herself. Her parents gave Tammie Jo a practical piece of advice.
Find what you're suited for and get busy.
Tammie Jo didn't have to look too far to find what she was suited for. All she had to do was look up. Tammie Jo's family lived in Tularosa, New Mexico, not very far from Holloman Air Force Base. Between chores, Tammie Jo would stare up at the sky, watching fighter pilots practicing maneuvers above the ranch.
I started thinking about the jets that were always dogfighting overhead. And I started realizing, okay, there's somebody in those cockpits. I mean, I've been enjoying the jets for years, but realizing there's somebody inside doing that. Why not? Why not me?
Tammie Jo made a plan. She would join the military, which would pay for her to learn to fly. And Tammie Jo's parents supported her dream. They had never discouraged her from doing anything because she was a girl. But Tammie Jo found discouragement in other places, from an Air Force recruiter and her guidance counselor. She set her dreams aside and went to college. Still, she never lost sight of her dream. After graduating, she finally saw her opportunity in a newspaper ad.
The Air Force was running advertisements in the local paper saying, if you have your 4-year degree and want to fly, Uncle Sam wants you. Apply to your local Air Force recruiter. I thought, oh, God's timing. I mean, look at this. I have my degree and they need pilots. It doesn't line up any better than this.
So Tammie Jo went to the Air Force recruiter.
And he goes, we don't recruit girls for piloting. And he just looked at me like, what were you thinking?
Tammie Jo went home without a job, but she didn't give up. She clipped the ad out of the paper. A few weeks later, she brought it with her to the same recruitment office. She hoped she could talk to a different recruiter, but the same man was there.
He had the same reaction. And I said, well, I know that there are women who fly in the military. I met one. And he goes, well, we don't recruit them from the street.
Tammie Jo was persistent. She went back again to the recruitment office. This time, an officer asked her if she had a brother. So Tammie Jo tried the Army. The recruiter didn't want her either. That's when a friend told Tammie Jo she might have more luck with the Navy. And she did. Tammie Jo began her paperwork. Then she took the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery Test, also known as the ASVAB. It's a standardized test. Think of it as the military's version of the SATs, but it's a lot more extensive. Trust me, it isn't fun.
It's hours long. I want to say 600, 800 questions covering everything from calculus to engineering and aerodynamics and things that, quite honestly, I had a hard time spelling at that time.
Tammie Jo studied for 6 months for this test. Her scores were good enough to send her to officer candidate school, or so she thought. But then her Navy recruiter had a message for her.
I had scored high enough for a man, but not for a woman.
Tammie Jo felt that the door had finally closed for her. She spent the next 2 years working different jobs. She went back to school to get her teaching certificate, but she couldn't let go of her dream.
And so I did what I did with everything since basically 8th grade summer. I put it before the Lord. And I just said, Lord, take away this drive. I just need to settle into a practical life. I need something that I can get the tools to do and that I would be allowed to do. The more I prayed about just take away this want of flying, the worse it got. And so I finally decided, okay, Lord, one more time. I'm going to talk to one more recruiter and then I'm done with it. I'm moving on.
Tammie Jo went to a naval recruiting office she had never been to. She told the recruiter about her predicament, that she had scored high enough for a man on the ASVAB, but not high enough for a woman.
And he just started laughing. I wasn't sure what he was laughing at first, but then he goes, there's no such criteria. I don't know who told you this, but what's your social security number? And he typed it in. He goes, your score's fine. It's great.
It turns out there had never been different cutoff scores for male and female applicants. Tammie Jo had been lied to. She worked with the recruiter to get her paperwork in order. A few months later, she was off to boot camp. She was on her way to becoming a pilot in the United States Navy. Tammie Jo was getting to live her dream, but I'd like you to remember that Tammie Jo joined the Navy in 1985. If you listened to our first episode about Heather Penny, you'll remember something called the Combat Exclusion Policy, which prevented women from serving in combat roles. Tammie Jo understood that she was entering a world where she knew her military service could look dramatically different from her male counterparts. However, there was a silver lining for women in the Navy. Unlike the other military branches, women in the Navy were allowed to fly tactical aircrafts. This meant that they could participate in training exercises. They could even be instructors. Tammie Jo and the other female pilots did not focus on what they weren't allowed to do. Instead, they focused on serving their country.
To be honest with you, we really didn't even talk about it. It wasn't taboo. We were still walking on water because we were studying French and Chinese and Russian weapons and tactics and then simulating those.
They were also just flat out busy.
As a junior officer, you're not only doing these missions and keeping up your airwork and your knowledge of your aircraft, but you're running a division. Like I was a NATOPS officer at first, which is just keeping your pilots and backseaters up on all of their aircraft knowledge, procedures, emergency procedures, things like that. And then I went to being a division officer of what we called AVARM, which had 3 different shops: avionics, electronics, and ordnance.
Tammie Jo had waited years to become a naval aviator, and she loved it. Every day was an adventure, and when Tammie Jo saw the movie Top Gun, she saw some of her own aviation experiences in the film. But that doesn't mean life always felt like a movie. Tammie Jo and her fellow female pilots were not always welcome by some of the men they served with.
Could we see the disparity in treatment? Of course. And I was glad I served with ladies that took it in stride. Nobody got on a soapbox and just demanded respect. We all felt like, you know what? We'll know and study and be the best pilot we are at the mission we have.
Throughout multiple periods in her career, Tammie Jo served as an instructor to other naval aviators. But as a woman, she did not always get the best assignments. One commanding officer made it clear he felt that women could only go so far in the naval hierarchy. After Tammie Jo expressed her disagreement, her commanding officer retaliated. He assigned Tammie Jo the course both instructors and students dread, OCF. That stands for Out of Control Flight. Students and instructors would work through live scenarios where they built the habits pilots needed during moments of crisis.
We would just take the aircraft up, at 30,000 feet. I would either put it into a stall, pulling power back, maintaining the nose, and just letting the airspeed decay until the nose would drop and they would put in the proper inputs to fly us out of the stall. When the tip tank fuel burned off, then we would go into something a little more dramatic. Straight up and down, zero airspeed. Lots of rudder inputs or Lumschwachs. Just something disorienting to start the spin, and negative, positive lateral Gs. Truthfully, as disorienting as possible.
It was kind of like a roller coaster ride. And I'm not just talking about the thrills and the speed. Not every student had the stomach for it.
I would often become familiar with what they had for breakfast that day.
And if Tammie Jo's students couldn't get the plane under control, Tammie Jo was there to begin the training exercise again.
We'd climb back up, depart, recover, repeat, about 10 times.
As Tammie Jo rose through the ranks, things began to change. Things were changing in the Navy too. In 1990, Rosemary Mariner became the first woman to command an aviation squadron in the Navy. She was also Tammie Jo's commanding officer.
She was the first woman in the history of our nation to be the skipper of an aviation squadron. She was in the very first class of women to fly in the Navy, which was the first military branch to allow women in planes at all.
And for the first time, Tammie Jo was also serving in a squadron with other women.
I had always been the lone female in my squadron for 4 squadrons. Suddenly, I feel like I'm in the land of women, but really there was just four of us pilots.
Things were changing in the military more broadly as well. It had become an open secret that the combat exclusion policy would soon be lifted for female aviators. This meant that for the first time in U.S. history, female pilots would soon be able to fly in combat situations. Tammie Jo was selected to be part of the first group of women to train on the FA-18 Hornet, the Navy's premier aircraft. It was everything Tammie Jo had dreamed of. In her memoir, she calls the plane the Ferrari of the sky. But one of Tammie Jo's instructors was not happy about it.
This instructor decides, no, you know what? I just don't think you should be flying this jet. I don't think any female should be flying these jets. This just kept going until I finally had to tell him, sir, I lead a 4-plane formation in about 30 minutes and I have to set up my board. The decisions you're talking about are made by Congress. Be sure and vote because that's who makes those decisions, not me, not you. I'm just in a green suit, learning to fly an aircraft that's incredible. You know that, you've flown it. I want to learn from you, but I've got to go.
After Tammie Jo left the room, her instructor thought of another way to get back at her.
My training jacket just mysteriously went missing.
A training jacket is a record of every pilot's training history. Tammie Jo was told that without it, she could not continue her flight training. At this point in her career, Commander Mariner had transferred to a new position in Washington, D.C. Tammie Jo called her for advice.
She said, you don't want to go cutting through the jungle with a machete to make a trail because you are going to have to work with these people and you want camaraderie with these people. So she said, go to the base legal and just let him know that your training jacket has disappeared. And she gave me the right number of Freedom of Information Act something or other requests to submit it to the squadron. The interesting thing was, not only did my training jacket appear within, I think, 24 hours, but I got a call from the skipper saying, you will not speak to your former commanding officer ever again.
And just so you know, Tammie Jo ignored that so-called order. In 1993, the combat exclusion policy was finally lifted for female aviators. Tammie Jo's friend, Pam Lyons, became the first female naval aviator to fly in combat. But for Lieutenant Commander Tammie Jo Shults, it was time for a new adventure. She transitioned out of the Navy. She and her husband Dean started a family. They also both became pilots for Southwest Airlines. Which brings our story back to Southwest Flight 1380. The plane was rapidly losing altitude. Tammie Jo began to take control of the plane.
You definitely don't what we call horse around the controls of an out-of-controlled aircraft. And especially up in thin air, you want to be very pragmatic and wait to make sure that you're getting response from that input before you put more input in, or you'll depart it into another direction or deeper into the loss of control that you're in. So we got our hands on the controls and slowly put the aircraft back into balanced flight. We lost about 20,000 feet in the first 4 or 5 minutes.
The plane had also begun to rapidly depressurize.
There was a crescendo of noise that just got to a certain decimal, and it just smothered every sound. Darren and I sit about 1.5 feet away in the 737-700, and we couldn't even hear our own voice, let alone each other's. There was a cloud of smoke in the cockpit. You're not seeing what you need to see. You're not breathing well. There's an ice pick pain in your ears.
In that moment, Tammie Jo focused on the mantra the Navy had taught her.
Aviate, navigate, communicate.
So what had caused such a catastrophic explosion? Why was the plane out of control? An FAA investigation later determined that the explosion was caused by a piece of a turbine fan blade breaking. Shrapnel from the explosion struck the plane. The shrapnel hit a window on row 14. This caused the rapid depressurization, and most importantly, critically injured a passenger. But Tammie Jo didn't know any of this, because in that smoke-filled, deafening cabin, she had to draw on the habits she built in years of flying and focus solely on regaining control of the plane.
Habits on a good day, they become our instinct on a bad day, and we have this generous gift of choice in what we groom our instincts to be. Instincts aren't always naturally what they should be. That's one of the reasons we do out-of-control flight, because when you stall an aircraft, when the nose falls and you didn't tell it to fall, your natural instinct is to pull back on the nose, which would only put it deeper into the stall.
Tammie Jo's first officer, Darren, was also an Air Force veteran. He and Tammie Jo had similar training, which they drew upon to work together.
We both had the same measured idea of how to get it back into control. Before we could even communicate, I tapped him on the shoulder and we communicated who had the aircraft, because when we got our oxygen masks on, we really had to do it one at a time, because it took both hands, both feet, and our total attention to take care of the aircraft at that point. I will say my personal background of flying, not only the out-of-control flight, but also flying dynamic aircraft in upside-down situations, definitely gave me a calm and an ease with an aircraft that wasn't behaving normally.
Tammie Jo and Darren brought the plane to a comfortable altitude. The pressure in the plane began to equalize. Tammie Jo and Darren were able to communicate verbally once again. Tammie Jo handled the flying. Darren coordinated with the flight attendants who were helping passengers during a horrific situation.
Shanique Mallory, Rachel Fernheimer, Catherine Sandoval.
Those are the names of the flight attendants on Southwest Flight 1380.
They got up out of seats. It left them with bruised ribs, sprained back, cuts, and bruises all over.
Passengers were helping too.
Andrew Needham, Tim McGinty, 78-year-old Peggy Phillips, retired school nurse.
These are only a few of the many brave people who got out of their seats to help other passengers. Some of them were helping Jennifer Reardon, the critically injured passenger. The clock was ticking. Darren identified Philadelphia International Airport as the best place for Tammie Jo to land the plane. 20 minutes after its left engine failed, Tammie Jo Shults landed Southwest Flight 1380. Just 20 minutes. Think about that. You've been listening to this podcast for more than 20 minutes, but that's all it took. In those 20 minutes, Tammie Jo was tested like never before. She didn't know this, but she had been preparing her entire life for this moment, and so had her crew.
I look at the way like Darren reacted, Shanique, Catherine, Rachel, Peggy, Andrew Needham, Tim. I look at the way those people reacted. You know that wasn't the first day they had reacted selflessly. You don't rise to an occasion because of pressure. You have to have practiced some pretty good foundational behavior to let pressure bring out the good. I was very proud of the way that they handled everything. But the passengers, they could have easily stayed buckled up, yet they didn't. And I don't think that they were heroic that day for the first time. I really do think they were people who had made a habit of giving hope to other people.
There were a total of 149 people on board Southwest Flight 1380. 148 of them returned home, but one did not. Jennifer Reardon suffered fatal injuries during the flight. Jennifer had been heading back home to Albuquerque after a business trip. She was a devoted mother, wife, and a prominent philanthropist. Her family has started a foundation in her memory. Tammie Jo retired from commercial aviation in 2020. That same year, she was inducted into the International Air and Space Hall of Fame. Today, she volunteers as a pilot for charitable organizations, once again putting her lifetime of habits to use for good. Tammie Jo's passion for aviation led her to live a life based around the cultivation of habits. And her legacy continues at Holloman Air Force Base. In a few months, her son, an Air Force pilot, will be training there. You'll be able to find him in the same New Mexico sky that set his mother on her incredible journey. Stay with us after the break, where we'll ask Tammie Jo a few more questions. Last week was Veterans Day. I'd like to wish a happy belated Veterans Day to you, Tammie Jo. What does Veterans Day mean to you?
When I think about Veterans Day, the first veteran that comes to my mind is the first one I met, which was my dad. He served during the Korean War. and he sent every paycheck home uncashed to his folks and supplemented, or I would say supported himself by being a barber in his off time and selling his government issued cigarettes one at a time. He was a truck mechanic in the Air Force and then 2 more years in the Army. And when I see that love of family that pulled him forward to a love of country and then came back full circle in that love of family, just making that circular stitch of patriotism, it's inspiring. This is a story that he didn't talk about, that my mom is the one who told me after he had passed away. I look at that and I realize just what a gift we have in our country. We are an experiment in freedom that has never been done before. We're not pulled together because of race or religion or royalty. We're a group of people, not perfect people, and so we're not a perfect country, but we are a group of people pulled together behind an ideal, and that is the ideal of freedom. I think freedom and love go hand in hand. I got to see it.
What a beautiful story and an incredible tribute to your father. Now, you are also incredibly passionate about aviation. What drew you towards it?
Amelia Earhart really said it well when she said, adventure is worthwhile. It may sound frivolous, but it's so true. I think adventure is what pulls us forward to do things that we might not normally have the spark of enthusiasm to do. And there will always be adversity in adventures. I think adventure has that winsome way of pulling us back up on our feet and back into the game of life. And so just having that draw, that adventure, and just the thrill of flight, whether you're watching it or doing it, is I feel like it's innate in aviation. Probably everyone feels that way about their own chosen path, but that was definitely, it resonated with me. I'd never flown, never touched an airplane, never saw one up close, but it was what kind of just resonated with my mind and made me hungry to learn more.
Are you familiar with e.l.f. cosmetics?
Through the years, e.l.f. cosmetics was one of the things that I could get, at the corner store in Philadelphia or Amarillo or San Diego. And then having a daughter, Sydney, who's now 26, she introduced me to even more of e.l.f. cosmetics. So we have enjoyed that freedom of getting to try things without having to financially invest in a way that we could only try one eyeshadow.
Do you have a favorite e.l.f. product?
I would say they're eyeshadows. The eyeliner, I use some, but that would be what I would say we have enjoyed, my daughter and I both.
Do you have any military beauty hacks?
I thought I would never tell anybody this because it's inconsequential, but in the military, we didn't wear anything but like mascara and eyeliner because first of all, you would sweat it off. And second of all, you're not supposed to have anything petroleum-based on your face with 100% oxygen under pressure, because if there was a fire, of course, the 100% oxygen is just rich with a fire hazard. So we didn't have anything, any foundational makeup. But eyes, we could still, look like girls with our eyes. And so I got away without mascara and eyeliner, and I realized, okay, black ballpoint pen, it's pretty good eyeliner. The Navy issue black ballpoint pen. So, oh, that's called desperate. I think today I might try for a Sharpie or something. It's a little softer.
On behalf of both myself and e.l.f. Cosmetics, I'd like to thank Tammie Jo Shults for her service to our country. We also thank her for sharing her incredible story. In our next episode, we'll be joined by Army veteran Dr. Vanessa Schreiber, who received 2 Purple Hearts and numerous commendations while serving in Afghanistan and Iraq. In the meantime, I ask you to reflect on what it means to be able to execute with quality and speed, to bring out the best of yourself in a crisis. There's no time like the present. Because if Tammie Jo's story has taught me anything, it's that we never know what the future holds. If you would like to learn more about how you can help or donate to women veterans, check out Woven, the Women Veterans Network at wovenwomenvets.org. Woven's mission is to provide a unique social network of women veterans to foster connections and build relationships in local communities and across the nation. Valor is produced by Emerald Audio, an imprint of Diversion. Be sure to follow the podcast to get notifications about new episodes. My name is Deshauna Barber, and I hosted this episode. This episode was directed by Rex New. This episode was written by Rex New and was story edited by Sarah B. Editing by Antonio Enriquez. Produced by Emma Demuth. Leo Culp is our associate producer. Executive produced by Scott Waxman and Roy Laughlin. Check out emeraldaudio.net to learn more about this show and other shows we produce.